My name is Claire Donnelly, and 20 hours after we buried my father, my brother changed the locks on our family restaurant and told me I had until sunrise to clear out my things. He didn't say it in private. He said it in front of the hostess stand, under the old neon crab sign my father welded with his own hands back in 1989, while two line cooks, one dishwasher, and the woman who had served coffee in that place for 18 years stood there pretending not to listen. My stepmother, Linda, stood beside him in black pearls and widow makeup, one hand folded over the other, like she was attending a board meeting instead of a betrayal. Evan held up the new keys, smiled that polished smile he used for investors and wedding toasts, and said, "Dad made it clear. The restaurant is mine now. Claire's just been helping out." Helping out. I had spent 3 years keeping that place open while my father's hands shook too badly to sign invoices. I had slept on a cot in the office during hurricane season to protect the walk-in freezer when the back wall flooded. I had learned which suppliers would give us 2 extra weeks when cash got tight, which customers tipped well enough to quietly cover a server's gas money, and exactly how long my father could stand before the pain in his spine drove him back into the office. But I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I looked at Evan and asked one question. "Did you read the paper Dad hid behind the old menu board? Or just the page with your name on it?" He laughed. That was the moment I knew he had no idea what my father had really done. Before I tell you how that happened, take a second to like the video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what happened next didn't just split my family. It exposed a lie that had been dressed up as love for most of my life. And by the time my brother understood the truth, he had already destroyed the only deal that could have saved him. 3 years earlier, I was living in Chicago, working 60-hour weeks as an assistant operations manager for a restaurant group that owned 4 upscale seafood places and one rooftop bar where nobody ever actually ate. I was good at my job. Not glamorous good, not Instagram good, useful good. The kind of good that keeps payroll clean, waste low, and customers happy without anyone noticing who made it happen. Then I got a call on a Thursday at 2:13 in the afternoon. It wasn't my father. It was Mateo, our head cook back home in Bayshore. His voice was low and rough the way it got when he was scared. "Claire," he said, "your dad collapsed in the dry storage room. Ambulance took him 10 minutes ago. Evan's not answering. You need to come." I was in a supply meeting when he called. I left my laptop open, grabbed my bag, and was in a cab to O'Hare before my boss finished asking if everything was okay. It wasn't. The flight felt endless. The drive from the airport to Bayshore Medical felt longer. When I finally walked into my father's hospital room, he was awake, pale, and irritated. That's how Frank Donnelly handled fear. He turned it into annoyance and handed it to everyone else. "Don't look at me like that," he muttered when he saw my face. "I'm not dead. Not dead. Not yet." The doctor came in 10 minutes later and told us my father had not only suffered a cardiac event, but the tremors he'd been ignoring for more than a year were consistent with advancing Parkinson's. I remember Linda crying immediately. I remember Evan arriving 40 minutes after that in a navy blazer, smelling like expensive cologne and outside air, already talking about specialists and next steps like he'd been there all day. And I remember my father looking straight at me, not Linda, not Evan, and saying, "The Friday fish order comes in at 6 tomorrow. Make sure they check the cord before they sign." That was my father. Even from a hospital bed, he was thinking about the restaurant. And I didn't realize then that when he asked me about the fish order, he was really asking me not to leave. To understand what came next, you need to understand my family. My brother Evan is 4 years older than me and came out of the womb looking like a campaign poster. Tall, confident, camera ready, the kind of man who can say absolutely nothing in a deep voice and still sound important. He never worked harder than I did. He just got more credit for standing closer to the spotlight. Growing up, I was the daughter who remembered birthdays, took notes, stacked plates, and stayed late. Evan was the son who made grand entrances and received applause for existing. My father loved us both, I believe that. But he understood us differently. To him, Evan was the future of the Donnelly name. I was the backup system. Reliable, practical, forgettable, until something broke. Linda came into our lives when I was 26, 2 years after my mother died. She wasn't evil. That would have been easier. Linda was polished, strategic, and deeply invested in appearances. She liked charity galas, tasteful sympathy, and phrases like brand consistency. She also believed the restaurant should eventually become something more elegant than what it was, a stubborn, beloved, slightly crooked seafood place on the bay where half the town had cried into chowder at least once. When Dad got sick, Evan said all the right things. We'll handle it as a family. We'll get organized. We'll protect the business. Then, in the very next week, he returned to Charleston 3 times for client meetings, posted one photo of himself at Dad's bedside, and told people online that he was stepping in to help run the family company. He had no idea how to run that restaurant. He didn't know the freezer alarm code. He didn't know which fryer stuck on humid days. He didn't know that the Tuesday lunch crowd ordered less from the menu and more from memory. I did. So, when hospital days turned into specialist appointments and specialist appointments turned into treatment schedules, I started extending my stay. Then I stopped using the word stay. Because deep down, I already knew I wasn't going back to Chicago. I just hadn't admitted yet what it was going to cost me. And I definitely had no idea how much it would cost my father to watch me pay it. Dad got discharged after 5 days with medication changes, a binder full of instructions, and the kind of stubborn optimism men use when they're terrified and don't want to say it out loud. For the first 2 weeks, I told myself I was only in Bayshore temporarily. Just until the staffing schedule stabilized. Just until Linda understood the vendor accounts. Just until Evan cleared enough time to be physically useful instead of verbally supportive. That fantasy lasted 12 days. On day 13, the lunch manager quit without notice. On day 14, the refrigeration unit in prep started leaking. On day 15, Dad dropped a coffee mug because his hand locked in the middle of lifting it, and the sound of it shattering on the kitchen tile made him so angry he locked himself in the office for an hour. That night, I sat with him after closing. No customers, no Linda, no Evan. Just me and my father in the dark dining room, the chairs turned upside down on the tables, the bay outside reflecting the moon in broken silver lines. You should go back, he said without looking at me. I knew he didn't mean it. Can you run this place tomorrow if I leave? I asked. He didn't answer. That was answer enough. I called Chicago the next morning and resigned. My boss tried to talk me out of it, said I had a promotion track, said people would kill for my position. Maybe they would have. But none of those people had watched their father stare at his own hands like they had betrayed him. So I packed up my apartment, sold half my furniture, put the rest into storage, and moved back into my old room above the garage behind the restaurant. The room still had a warped window frame, and one wall my mother had painted sea glass blue 20 years earlier. I told myself it was practical, temporary, necessary. All the lies people tell themselves when love is about to become labor. By the end of that month, I was opening the restaurant at 5:30, closing it after 10, balancing books at midnight, and helping my father button his cuffs before doctor's appointments in between. And while the whole town kept praising Evan for stepping up, he still didn't know where we kept the spare register tape. That would have been laughable if it hadn't become dangerous. Running a family restaurant while your father is getting sicker is like trying to keep a boat steady with one hand while the tide keeps changing direction. Every week, something new gave way. A supplier raised prices. A freezer fan burned out. A server got the flu. The fryer pilot wouldn't stay lit. Dad's medication made him dizzy, then rigid, then tired in ways I had never seen before. I took over payroll, inventory, scheduling, vendor negotiations, and most of the back office math. Mateo handled the kitchen like a saint with a knife roll. Deirdre, our senior server, quietly trained 2 new hires because she could see I was drowning before I said it. And Evan? Evan began referring to himself as co-owner at local chamber events while asking me by text whether we still carried coleslaw. Linda hosted sympathy lunches for people who wanted updates on Frank. She meant well, maybe, but she never stayed long enough to mop a floor or close a till. She liked being adjacent to sacrifice, not inside it. The money got tighter first. That's how crisis usually arrives, not through a dramatic bang, but through numbers that stop stretching. Dad had always run the restaurant conservatively. No unnecessary debt, no flashy expansions, but treatment travel, specialist bills, maintenance delays, and a bad tourist season started cutting into everything. I stopped paying myself in month 4, didn't announce it, didn't complain, just quietly moved money where it had to go and started using my savings to cover what the business couldn't. When the hostess asked for an advance because her son needed asthma medication, I gave it to her from my personal account. When the bay storm tore half the back awning loose, I put the materials on my own credit card and spent 6 hours on a ladder in freezing rain with Mateo holding the beam in place. Evan posted a photo the next day with the caption, "Protecting what matters most." He hadn't been there, not for the storm, not for the ladder, not for the invoices spread across my bed at 1:20 in the morning while I tried to decide whether we could afford crab that week. And the first time I realized something worse than illness was happening was when I found a charge on the business card that nobody could explain. The charge was for $4,860 at a luxury hotel in Charleston. Not food, not linens, not equipment, not anything remotely connected to Donnelly's Pier House. At first, I thought it was fraud. Cards get skimmed, numbers get stolen. It happens. But when I pulled the previous statements, there were more. Private club charges, boutique furniture, a designer men's store, a consulting dinner that cost more than our entire Thursday lunch revenue, all on the business line, all approved under an executive access code I didn't use. I took the statements to Dad after close. He sat in the office with his reading glasses low on his nose, one hand trembling against the ledger while he tried to sign for a liquor delivery. I laid the pages in front of him. He read the first one, then the second, then leaned back slowly. "Did Evan do this?" I asked. Dad was quiet a long time, long enough for the overhead fan to click through 4 rotations. Finally, he said, "Leave it for now." Leave it. That phrase nearly broke me, because I had been leaving things for now for months: my sleep, my career, my savings, my temper. "Dad, this isn't a misunderstanding," I said. "Someone is bleeding the business." He rubbed his forehead. "I know. You know." I stared at him. He knew. He had known. Maybe not every charge, maybe not every number, but enough. Enough to say it that way. Not shocked. Tired. "I'll handle Evan," he said. But he didn't. Not then. Not openly. And that was when I started understanding something I had spent my whole life trying not to see. My father loved my brother enough to protect him from consequences. He loved me enough to trust me with the fallout. There's a difference between those two kinds of love. A brutal difference. That night, while locking up, I found Linda in the dining room adjusting flowers that didn't need adjusting. She looked at me and said, "You seem tense." I almost laughed. Instead, I asked, "Did you know about the charges?" She held my gaze for half a second too long, and in that tiny pause, I got my answer. But what I didn't know yet was that my father had already started making plans behind all of our backs. A month after that, Dad started sending me on errands that made no sense. Not impossible errands, specific ones. Pick up the invoice book from Sal's on Harbor Road. Drive to the marine supply store in Weston. They've got the gaskets cheaper. Take Mateo to the fish auction and let him choose the bluefin himself. The tasks were plausible enough that I never questioned them in the moment. But each one got me out of the building for just long enough. 40 minutes, an hour, 90 minutes, once. And more than once, when I came back, Dad seemed strangely alert. Not healthier, just satisfied. Like a man who had managed something important without wanting credit for it. One afternoon, I pulled into the gravel lot behind the restaurant and saw a dark green sedan backing out near the delivery entrance. Not local, not familiar. The driver was a woman in a grey coat with a leather briefcase on the passenger seat. Dad was at the office window watching it leave. When I walked in, he pretended to be reading the paper. "Who was that?" I asked. "Insurance," he said too quickly. We didn't have insurance meetings at the loading door. I knew that. He knew I knew that. But his face had that closed expression he wore when he was asking for trust without explanation. So I let it go. Not because I wasn't curious, because by then I was so tired that if he wanted one corner of his life to remain private, I didn't have the strength to pry it open. A week later, Aunt May, Dad's older cousin, a retired school principal with the emotional subtlety of a fire alarm, came by with tuna casserole and 3 magazines I knew Dad would never read. She waited until he went to rest upstairs before saying, "Your father is not nearly as helpless as he wants people to think." I smiled. "That sounds like him." She leaned closer. "No, sweetheart. I mean, he's doing something, planning something." "For the restaurant?" "For justice," she said. Then she patted my hand like that clarified everything. At the time, I thought she was being dramatic. I had no idea she was the only person in the family telling me the truth. And by the time I realized what she meant, my brother had already begun spending money he didn't legally own. The first time my father spoke plainly about fear was 6 months before he died. It was late. Rain on the windows, the dining room empty except for one overturned mop bucket, and the smell of bleach and old fryer oil. He was sitting in booth 7 because stairs were harder by then, and the office chair hurt his back. His voice had gone softer over the year, but not weaker. "There's a difference." "Claire," he said, staring out at the bay, "if something happens faster than we expect, don't let anyone rush you." That got my full attention. Rush me how? With decisions, with papers, with sympathy. People always hurry after a death. Makes them feel useful. I sat across from him. He looked older that night than I had ever allowed myself to notice. Not because of wrinkles, because of fragility. Like time had finally found the seam in him. "I need you to remember 2 things," he said. "First, the business isn't what people think it is." I frowned. "Meaning?" "Meaning the story everyone tells about who built it, who deserves it, who can run it." He shook his head. "Stories are cheap." "And the second thing?" He looked me right in the eye then. "If you ever feel cornered, call Marabelle before you answer anyone." "Marabelle?" "My attorney." So that was the woman in the green sedan. He nodded once. "She has copies of everything." Everything. The word landed heavy. I wanted to ask 10 questions. What everything? Why secret copies? Why not just tell me now? But he was tired, and I had learned to measure every difficult conversation against the energy it would cost him. So instead, I said, "Okay." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small brass key, and slid it across the table. "For the panel behind the old menu board in the office," he said. "Don't open it unless you need to." I picked up the key. It was warm from his hand. I kept it in my apron pocket for 8 months and never used it, because some part of me still believed there would be time later. More time for explanations, more time for truth, more time for my father to just be my father instead of becoming a puzzle I would have to solve after he was gone. I was wrong. And the last week of his life proved just how much he had seen, including the betrayal forming right in front of him. In the final week, the restaurant was quieter. Not because business was bad, because everybody sensed something. Dad stopped coming downstairs entirely. Mateo ran the kitchen. I handled the floor, the books, the suppliers, the medication charts, and the visitors. Evan came by twice that week, both times in loafers too clean for a working kitchen. The first time, he brought a photographer from some regional lifestyle magazine doing a family legacy feature on coastal businesses. I nearly threw them both into the bay. Dad was barely able to sit up, and Evan wanted golden hour photos by the oyster mural. When I told him no, he looked offended. "It's good exposure." "For who?" I asked. He didn't answer. The second time, he arrived with Linda and a folder. They spent 40 minutes upstairs in Dad's room with the door mostly closed. When they came out, Linda was red-eyed. Evan looked controlled, which was always how he looked when he'd gotten something he wanted. I asked Dad later what that meeting was about. He said, clean up. That was it. Clean up. 2 days after that, he stopped eating much. 3 days after that, hospice came in. The night before he died, I sat beside him while the rain tapped the windows and the sign outside hummed weakly against the dark. He was in and out. But once, just once, he opened his eyes fully and said, did you keep the key? Yes. Good girl. I hated that phrase when I was 13. That night it nearly destroyed me. He looked past me toward the office door, then back at me. Not the first paper, he whispered. The right one. I leaned closer. What right paper? But he had already drifted again. He died the next afternoon at 3:11, while the lunch specials were still written on the chalkboard and a delivery of soft-shell crabs sat untouched in the cooler. And less than a day later, my brother decided grief would have to wait. Because greed, apparently, had a tighter schedule. Dad's funeral was held at St. Mark's by the Water, the old stone church where locals got baptized, married, and buried in the same building if they stayed in Bayshore long enough. It was packed. Not because my father was easy. He wasn't. Because he was solid. He loaned money quietly, fixed things without invoices, and once fed half the marina after a storm knocked power out for 3 days. People respect that kind of man, even when they don't fully like him. Evan gave the eulogy. Of course he did. He wore a charcoal suit and spoke in that warm, practiced cadence people use when they know exactly how they look while mourning. He talked about legacy, tradition, how his father had taught him to lead. I sat in the second pew and kept my hands folded so tightly my nails marked crescents into my palms. Dad had taught Evan to speak. He had taught me to stay. Those are not the same lesson. After the burial, everyone drifted toward the restaurant for the reception, because in Bayshore, grief still gets served with coffee and casseroles. I helped set out trays. I refilled the urn. I hugged people whose names I barely heard. And sometime between the pound cake and the last round of condolences, Evan disappeared. I didn't think much of it. Not until dusk, when the last non-family guest left, and I walked outside to lock the side entrance. That's when I saw the locksmith van. New deadbolt on the office, new lock on the back entrance, new key cylinder at the main door. Evan stood near the hostess stand rolling the new keys around his finger. Linda beside him. Mateo frozen near the pass. And Evan said, calm as weather. I'm taking over from here. I asked, from where? He smiled. From you. Then he pulled a folded document from his jacket, tapped the page, and told me the restaurant belonged to him now. What he didn't know yet was that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life in front of witnesses. Evan laid the paper on table 12 like he was presenting a winning hand. It looked official. Letterhead. Signatures. Enough legal language to scare anyone too emotional to read carefully. He tapped a line halfway down the page. Dad designated me successor managing owner of Donnelly Spear House. Linda added, Frank wanted clarity. We all need to respect that. Respect. Families love that word when they mean obedience. I picked up the page. Read it once. Then again. It was old. I could tell before I even found the date because the address for the business still listed our old P.O. box from before the hurricane renovation. And there was no staple mark, no page number, no continuation line, just one clean page, carefully copied, selectively useful. Mateo looked at me like he was waiting for permission to throw my brother into the soup kettle. Deirdre had gone pale. Even Linda seemed relieved by how certain Evan sounded, like certainty itself could replace due process. You've got until sunrise, Evan said. Take whatever's personal. I'll review staffing Monday. There it was. Not grief, not family, a takeover. And maybe it would have worked on someone who didn't know how paperwork ages. Maybe it would have worked on someone who hadn't spent 3 years balancing every line item in that business while my father's hands failed him. But I knew two things instantly. First, that page was not the whole story. Second, Evan had no idea Dad had warned me about exactly this, so I asked him the question,
Did you read the paper Dad hid behind the menu board? I said. Or just the page with your name? He laughed. Actually laughed. Linda frowned. What menu board? Evan folded his arms. Claire, don't do this. Don't turn Dad's funeral into a scene. I almost admired that.
The way he created the scene and then blamed me for standing in it. I'm not doing anything, I said. I'm telling you not to make a legal decision based on one photocopied page. Legal decision? He said. It's my restaurant. I looked at the keys in his hand, then at the office door, then at the old faded menu board mounted on the hallway wall. And for the first time since my father died, I felt something sharper than grief. Direction. Because hidden behind that board was a lock my brother had never noticed. I didn't open the panel that night. That's the part people always want to know. Why not? Why not yank the menu board off the wall in front of everyone and force the truth into the room? Because truth lands harder when the wrong people are already committed to the lie. And because my father had not raised me to panic in public just because someone else was acting shameless. So I said only this. Call Mara Bell before you do anything stupid. Evan's expression shifted a fraction. Not fear. Recognition. He had heard the name before. Linda, too. Which told me more than either of them meant to reveal. Dad handled his affairs with our attorney in Charleston, Evan said quickly. No, I replied. He handled the truth with Mara Bell. Then I took my purse, my notebook, the spare cash log from the drawer and left. I didn't go far. I went upstairs to the room above the garage, locked the door, and sat on the bed with my father's brass key in my palm. My hands were shaking so hard I had to press them against my knees. Not because I was afraid of what I'd find, because I was afraid of what it would confirm. At midnight, when the building was finally quiet, I went back down. The restaurant smelled like lemons, coffee grounds, and old wood, the way it always had after closing. I stood in the hallway, lifted the old menu board from its hidden hinge, and found a narrow wooden panel behind it. The key fit on the first try. Inside was a slim fireproof envelope. Nothing dramatic, no treasure map, no handwritten confession. Just one envelope, one business card, and a note in my father's blocky handwriting. If Evan moves first, you call Mara before you answer anyone. Bring this unopened. Trust paper, not performance. Dad. I sat down right there on the hallway floor and stared at the note until the words blurred. Because even dying, my father had known exactly what my brother would do. And even more unsettling than that, he had planned for it. Mara Bell's office sat above a real estate agency on Front Street in a brick building that smelled faintly of old paper and sea air. She was in her late 50s, silver-haired, precise, and had the kind of eyes that made you feel like lying in front of her would physically exhaust you. When I handed her the envelope, she didn't open it immediately. She offered me water first. That was when I knew the contents would change something permanent. Inside were copies of a living trust, 2 amendments, a debt schedule, and a sealed letter to be read only if there was a dispute over control of the restaurant. Mara arranged them in front of us with the calm of someone who had watched families implode before breakfast. Your father transferred the building and restaurant operations into the Donnelly Coastal Trust 11 months ago, she said. I just stared. Transferred. 11 months. While I was fixing fryers and tracking medication times, my father had quietly moved the entire future of the business out of open reach. The original structure left majority operating control to Evan upon Frank's death, Mara continued. That changed 6 months ago. She slid the amendment toward me. I read it once, then again, and then the room went strangely quiet. The amendment named me controlling managing beneficiary of the restaurant and sole controlling owner of the building trust. Me. Not because Dad loved Evan less. Because he wrote in exact legal language that I had demonstrated continuous stewardship essential to the preservation of the business. There was more. A debt offset schedule documenting every unapproved charge Evan had made to business accounts over the previous 18 months. Hotel stays, clothing, private club invoices, even furniture. My father had not ignored it. He had classified it as an advance against Evan's inheritance interest. Mara folded her hands. If your brother contests and loses, his remaining share converts into debt recovery under the trust. I looked up slowly. You mean if he fights this, he risks leaving with nothing? And suddenly, Evan's confidence made horrifying sense. He thought he was early. He had no idea he was already too late. I asked Mara the question I hadn't wanted to ask for years. Did Dad ever say why he didn't just tell me? Mara's expression changed, softer. Because he was ashamed, she said. That hit harder than I expected. Not of me, of himself. She opened the sealed letter and read part of it aloud because my hands had started trembling again. In it, my father wrote that a business built on labor should belong to the person who actually carried it. That leadership wasn't charm, wasn't bloodline performance, wasn't the child who spoke best at public events. It was the person who showed up before dawn and stayed when everything stopped being romantic. He wrote that he had confused charisma with readiness for too long, and that by the time he understood the difference, I had already paid for his mistake in hours, money, and years of my life. I cried then, not neatly, not elegantly, the ugly kind, the kind that comes from being seen too late and perfectly at once. Mara waited. When I could breathe again, I asked what happened next. Nothing dramatic, she said. That's the beauty of correct paperwork. We file notice, we notify parties, and your brother learns he cannot sell what he does not control. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was clean. After months of emotional chaos, the truth was going to arrive in black ink. Still, Mara warned me. Evan may react badly before he reacts rationally. He already had. She nodded. Then say as little as possible. Let him talk. Let him assume. People reveal the most when they think they're winning. So I drove back to the restaurant and said nothing. Not to Linda, not to Mateo, not even to Aunt May. Because for the first time in years, I wasn't scrambling to protect something. I was watching a trap close that my father had built himself, and the first person to step deeper into it was my brother. By noon the next day, Evan had already scheduled a developer walkthrough. That's how fast greed moves when it thinks paperwork is backing it. Bayshore had been changing for years. Old bait shops becoming boutiques. Weathered houses turning into short-term rentals with nautical fonts and overpriced soap. Developers had been circling our waterfront block for a while, and Evan always spoke about unlocking value like he was doing the town a favor. He showed up at the restaurant in a light blue button-down with a man named Russ Kessler from Tidefront Development. Russ wore boat shoes and the expression of someone who only touched history if he could convert it into square footage. I was at the prep counter portioning crab cakes when Evan walked in and said, loud enough for staff to hear, I'll need clean profit and loss statements for the last 3 years. I kept shaping the mixture. You'll need authority first. Russ gave a diplomatic smile. We're just exploring options. No, I said. You're touring property under disputed control. Evan laughed like I was being difficult for sport. Classic. When Mara's legal notice arrived 38 minutes later by courier, I almost believed in divine timing. Evan opened it at the hostess stand, read the first paragraph, then the second. His smile disappeared so fast it was almost elegant. Russ watched the color drain out of him. What is this? Evan snapped. Probate notice, I said. It says the trust. I know what it says. He didn't. Not really. Not yet. But he knew enough to realize he'd just brought a developer into a building he didn't own. Russ took one careful step back, then another. By the time Evan looked up, the man had already decided Tidefront Development did not want to be anywhere near Donnelly family litigation. And the best part? That wasn't even the worst surprise waiting in the file. People like Evan don't lose quietly. They narrate. That evening, he sent a long email to extended family, former staff, and 3 members of the local business association. I know because Deirdre forwarded it to me with the subject line. Well, the email was a masterpiece of polished dishonesty. He claimed I was emotionally unstable from grief, that I had isolated Dad during the illness, that I had influenced legal documents while Frank was vulnerable. He used phrases like out of concern for the business and temporary irregularities and unfortunate confusion surrounding estate administration. Nowhere in the email did he mention the developer, or the old photocopied page, or the fact that he had changed the locks before probate even began. He ended by saying he hoped the family could resolve this with dignity. That word again, dignity, always used by the people making a mess and demanding others clean it quietly. Messages started coming in. A cousin I hadn't seen in 2 years asked if I was okay emotionally. One of Dad's old friends texted, he wouldn't have wanted conflict, as if conflict was something I had chosen, like a paint color. I didn't respond to any of them. Mara had told me silence would do more than self defense. She was right. Because every hour Evan kept talking, he gave the truth more space to arrive and contradict him. Around 9 that night, Linda called. Not to apologize, not to ask how I was. To ask very carefully, what exactly did Frank sign? I smiled for the first time in days. Ask Mara, I said. Then I hung up. Because Linda, for all her polish, had finally realized something terrifying. Frank had not left her and Evan in control. He had left them informed just enough to embarrass themselves. And once Linda understood what else was in that trust file, I knew she would start protecting the only person she had ever really prioritized herself. Linda came to see me 2 mornings later before opening. No pearls, no makeup, no script. She stood in the kitchen doorway with the kind of stillness people only have when they've just learned their future was built on assumptions instead of facts. I met with Mara, she said. I kept slicing lemons. And? Her jaw tightened. Frank set up a residence fund for me. The condo downtown is mine. There's an annuity, medical coverage. He planned for me. That surprised her more than it surprised me. Dad may have been stubborn and emotionally clumsy, but he wasn't cruel. What did you think he'd do? I asked. She didn't answer, because the answer was obvious. She thought she and Evan would inherit control, sell strategically, and move forward under the language of practicality. She thought I would grieve quietly and leave. Instead, she had discovered Frank had provided for her comfortably, while deliberately keeping management away from both of them. There's a debt schedule attached, she said after a long pause. I set the knife down. Yes. Some of those charges, she said carefully, were for things Evan told me your father approved. There it was, the crack in the version she'd been living inside. I didn't rescue her from it. Linda looked around the kitchen, the old tile, the steam burns near the range, the prep lists taped to the fridge in my handwriting. I didn't understand how much of this was you, she said. It wasn't an apology, but it was the first honest sentence she had ever spoken to me. Most people didn't, I replied. She nodded once, like she had earned the right to feel wounded by that realization. Then she did something I never expected. She said, Evan is going to come after you hard. I held her gaze. Then maybe for the first time in his life, I said, he'll run into someone who isn't moving. And that afternoon, right on cue, my brother did exactly what desperate men always do when truth corners them. He called me screaming. I was in dry storage counting cans when my phone lit up with Evan's name. I answered on the fourth ring. No greeting, just breathing. Then, you think you're clever? Not hello. Not Claire. Not can we talk. Straight to wounded entitlement. I think Dad signed legal documents, I said. He exploded. Said I manipulated him. Said I poisoned Dad against him. Said I'd been lurking in the shadows for years waiting to steal what was his. It's fascinating how quickly people reveal their real beliefs when they don't get their way. Not once did he say, how could Dad feel that way? He said, how could you take what belongs to me? Ownership had always been emotional for Evan, not earned, assumed. You changed the locks the day after the funeral, I said quietly. You brought in a developer before probate. You told staff I was temporary in a business I've kept running for 3 years. And somehow I'm the thief? He went silent for 2 seconds, then tried a different angle. You know I can contest this. You can try. I will. Mara explained the no contest clause. That stopped him cold. I could hear the shift, the recalculation. If you challenge and lose, I continued, your remaining share gets consumed by the debt offset schedule. Dad documented everything. More silence, then very low. He kept score? That almost broke my heart. Because beneath the arrogance, I heard it. A son realizing his father had been watching more closely than he ever imagined. No, I said. He kept records. There's a difference. He laughed once, bitter and hollow. You always wanted him to choose you. I leaned against the shelf and closed my eyes. No, I said. I wanted him to see me. He finally did. And for the first time in my life, Evan had no line prepared for that. But by sundown, he found one last stage to stand on. And he tried to turn the whole town against me. Bayshore survives on gossip the way some places survive on rain. By the end of the week, everyone knew there was a Donnelly family inheritance fight. The details were wrong, of course. In one version, I had seduced an attorney into forging documents. In another, Evan had been cut out entirely, which wasn't even true. In the most absurd version, Linda had secretly sold the restaurant to a hotel chain, and I was refusing to leave because I had nowhere else to go. That one at least got my finances right. Then something unexpected happened. The staff started talking. Not maliciously. Honestly. Deirdre told one customer she hadn't seen Evan close a register in 10 years. Mateo reminded a supplier who had negotiated late payments through 2 bad seasons. Our dishwasher, Luis, told his cousin, who told half the marina, that I had personally covered his rent the month his wife had surgery. Tiny truths. Nothing dramatic. Just reality, finally moving mouth to mouth. And reality has a way of outliving performance in small towns. The shift became obvious on Saturday morning when old Mr. Hennessy, who had eaten fried flounder at our counter every Saturday since Bill Clinton was president, looked at Evan, then at me, and said, So which one of you actually knows where the tartar sauce is? The whole front counter went quiet. Evan forced a laugh. I didn't. Mr. Hennessy kept looking at him. Evan glanced toward the kitchen, toward me, toward the woman who had 5 minutes earlier already restocked the ramekins he didn't know existed. You see, Mr. Hennessy said, mostly to himself. That's what I thought. It was small, almost silly. But in families and towns, power doesn't only shift in courtrooms. Sometimes it shifts the moment everyone stops pretending the wrong person is essential. That night, Mara called with the probate hearing date. 3 weeks away. Just enough time for Evan to either accept reality or make one final spectacularly expensive mistake. Probate court was smaller than I expected. No soaring speeches, no dramatic gavels, just wood paneling, paperwork, and a judge who looked like she had no patience left for family mythology. Mara sat beside me with 3 binders, color-tabbed and terrifying. Evan arrived with his attorney in a navy suit and the expression of a man trying to look undefeated while standing on a trapdoor. Linda sat behind him, not beside him. That mattered. The judge reviewed the trust, the amendments, the debt schedule, witness certifications, business records, and Frank's physician statement regarding competency at the time of execution. Mara was surgical. No grandstanding. Just sequence, date, document, signature, charge, authorization, or lack of it. Evan's attorney asked a few questions about undue influence. Then Mara produced 3 years of staffing logs, payroll reports, vendor correspondence, and operational records showing who had actually managed the business day to day. My name was everywhere. Not because I wanted recognition, because labor leaves a paper trail. Then came the debt schedule. I watched Evan's attorney read the totals and physically sit back. The room got very quiet. Not because the number was shocking, because the pattern was, this wasn't one mistake. Not one emergency. It was a lifestyle funded through access he assumed would never be audited. The judge asked Evan directly whether he intended to contest the trust amendment. His attorney leaned toward him, whispered something. I didn't hear the words, but I knew the meaning. If he fought and lost, the no contest clause would crush what little remained. Evan stared straight ahead. For the first time in his life, charm could not enter the room and save him. Finally, he said, "No, Your Honor." Just like that. Years of family hierarchy collapsed into 2 syllables. And then Mara requested permission to read one final statement from my father. When she started reading, even Evan looked up. Because the last thing Frank Donnelly left behind wasn't property. It was a verdict. My father's statement was short. He wrote that Donnelly's Pier House should remain in the hands of the child who treated it as a responsibility instead of a reward. He wrote that love without accountability becomes indulgence, and indulgence had nearly cost the family its business. He wrote that he had failed to correct that imbalance sooner because it is easier to disappoint the reliable child, she stays, than the adored one, who might leave. That sentence hit me hardest. Because it was true, and because he knew it. He ended by saying this: Claire did not ask to be chosen. She asked to be trusted. I should have done that earlier. The hearing ended 20 minutes later. No fireworks, no shouting, just signatures, orders, and a legal reality my brother could not outtalk. 3 months after that, the title and operating control finalized. The restaurant was mine, fully, lawfully, undeniably mine. Linda moved into the condo Dad had left her. She sends a Christmas card now. Always tasteful, never personal. Evan sold his boat, downsized his apartment, and vanished from most local events. He texted me once last winter. You got what you wanted. I looked at that message for a long time. Then I replied, No, I got what I worked for. There's a difference. Now, when I unlock the restaurant before dawn, the keys are heavy in my hand in a way they never were before. Not because of metal, because of meaning. The neon crab still flickers on wet mornings. Mateo still complains like seasoning is a moral issue. Deirdre still knows everyone's secrets before they tell her. And some nights, when the last table leaves and the bay goes dark and quiet outside the windows, I stand in the dining room and think about my father. Not the man who waited too long, the man who, in the end, told the truth correctly. If you've ever been the one who stayed while someone else took credit, this story is for you. So tell me in the comments,